It was the second week of October in 1971, and the mill town of Corliss, Connecticut smelled the way it always did that time of year. Wet leaves, diesel off the rail spur, and the faint chemical sweetness of the dye house drifting up from the river. Every evening at 6, the mill whistle blew across the valley, and the whole town set its clocks by it. Up on the hill, the windows of Ashgrove University lit one at a time as the dark came down, close enough to see from the valley and far enough to belong to another world entirely. 19-year-old Nora Keene lived in the valley and worked on the hill. 6 afternoons a week she shelved books in the university library, saving every dollar toward the one thing no one in her family had ever managed: a teaching certificate, a classroom of her own. On the evening of October 12th, she stayed late to finish a cart of returns. She told the night clerk she'd take the river path home the way she always did. She stepped out into the dark. She never came home. 2 days later, they pulled Nora Keene from the Millward River and called it an accident. For 52 years, that was the only word Corliss ever used. Accident. But her 12-year-old sister was standing on the riverbank when they brought Nora up. And she would spend the next half a century refusing that word, until the morning they finally arrested a man whose name, by then, was carved in stone above the door of the very library where Nora Keene once worked. To understand how that was possible, you have to understand Corliss in 1971, a town split cleanly in two by a river and a hill. Down in the valley were the Mill families, the Keenes and the Farrows, and a few hundred others whose grandfathers had come over to run the looms, whose fathers still ran them, and whose sons were, that autumn, watching the mailbox for draft notices as the war ground on in a country most of them couldn't find on a map. The mill whistle ordered their days. The phones were party lines, so you learned young not to say anything on them. You didn't want the whole street to know. On summer nights, the boys raced muscle cars down River Road, and on autumn nights, the whole valley smelled of wood smoke and the dye house. Up on the hill was Ashgrove, old money, ivy, boys in blazers, a world the valley served but never entered, and the family that sat astride both worlds, that had built the mills and half the town and given Ashgrove its endowment, was the Nash family. In the autumn of 1971, the Nash heir was a charming young man of 27 named Everett, freshly graduated, already spoken of as a future trustee, the golden boy of the hill, who had lately taken to spending his afternoons in the university library, and who always seemed to find a reason to pass the cart where a mill girl named Nora Keene was shelving books. Nora was the oldest of the two Keene girls. Their father had died at the loom 2 winters before. Their mother took in sewing, and Nora carried the family the way oldest daughters did. She wore her father's flannel shirt when it turned cold. She couldn't swim and was frightened of the deep river, and took the path along the bank only because it was the fastest way home. And she kept, in her coat pocket, an old library due date card on which she wrote, in pencil, the titles of books she meant to read someday when there was time. A small, private list of a life she was still saving up for. Her little sister Alice, 12 years old that October, thought Nora hung the moon. On the afternoon of October 12th, Nora told her mother she'd be home by 7. She had a late cart to finish. That was the last time their mother heard her daughter's voice. The library closed to students at 6. Nora stayed to finish shelving. The night clerk saw her wheel the empty cart back a little after 6:30 and pull on her father's flannel and her coat. At 6:40, she signed out in the ledger by the door. The last thing in Nora Keene's own handwriting anyone would ever find. She took the river path. She always took the river path. A groundskeeper closing up the boathouse saw a young woman walking the bank in the last gray light, and saw, he thought, a man's figure further along under the sycamores near the old footbridge. He didn't think anything of it. It was 6:50. It was the last time anyone saw Nora Keene alive. At 7, her chair at the supper table was empty. By 8, her mother had walked to the corner and used the neighbor's phone. By 9, a handful of millmen were out along the river with lanterns, calling her name into the dark water. They found her coat first, snagged on a root below the footbridge. They did not find Nora. 2 days later, a fisherman found her nearly a mile downstream. The county coroner came, looked, and signed it in an afternoon. Accidental drowning. A girl walking a dark path by a high river. A slip, a tragedy. The kind of thing that happened. The file was closed almost before it opened, not as a homicide, not as anything but misadventure. Because that was the other thing about 1971, and about a mill town, and about a poor girl from the valley. When Nora Keene died, the questions that got asked were not about who might have hurt her. They were about her. Had she been out with a boy? Had she been the kind of girl who walked alone at night? The men with the authority to investigate had already decided what kind of story this was, and it was not the kind that got investigated. The Nash family, in a gesture the whole valley remembered as pure kindness, quietly paid for Nora's funeral. Gratitude has a way of closing mouths, but one man on that river didn't buy it. Dominic Farrow was a valley kid himself, 23 years old and 3 months into wearing a patrolman's uniform. He'd known the Keenes his whole life, and when he saw Nora's body, something wouldn't sit right. Nora was terrified of the water. Everyone in the valley knew it, and would no more have leaned over that high bank in the dark than flown. The marks on her didn't look, to his young and untrained eye, like a river. He said so. He was told, gently and then not so gently, that the coroner had ruled, and that a rookie would do well to leave the Nash family and the good people of the hill out of his imagination. So Dominic Farrow did the only thing a powerless young man could do. He took Nora's coat, the coat they'd pulled from the root, with something caught in its collar that wasn't hers, and he logged it, properly, and he put it in an evidence box for a case that officially wasn't one. And then he waited, for 50 years, for the world to catch up to what he already knew. It took most of his life. The decades did to Corliss what the decades did to a lot of New England mill towns. The looms went quiet in the 80s. The dye house closed. The valley hollowed out, storefront by storefront. And as the town below shrank, the university above it grew. And at the center of that growth, always, was the Nash name. Everett Nash became exactly what the Hill had promised he would be. A trustee, then chairman of the board. The family fortune, moved out of dyeing textiles and into finance, made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. And he gave with both hands to the one place that had always been his true home. He endowed chairs. He funded scholarships. And when the old university library was torn down in the 90s, he paid for the gleaming new one that rose in its place, and the university, grateful, carved his name above the door. The Nash Library. Everett Nash received an honorary degree, a portrait in the faculty club, and, one bright commencement, the keys to the campus he had saved. Down in the valley, Alice Keene grew up. She became, of all things, a teacher, the very thing her sister had been saving for the night she died. She married, raised children, taught 2 generations of valley kids, and never for one single day accepted the word accident. She kept a box of Nora's things on the top shelf of her closet. The father's flannel, a hair ribbon, and the little library due date card with its penciled list of books Nora never got to read. Every few years, Alice wrote another letter, to the police, to the county, to anyone who might listen, and every few years she got the same answer, or no answer at all. There was no case to reopen. It had been ruled an accident. There was nothing there. The only person who never told her that was old Dominic Farrow, retired now, who still had a copy of his notes in a drawer, and who told her, every time she asked, that when the day came, the coat would still be there. If you have ever been the only one who believed something, and been told for 50 years that you were wrong, you understand what kept Alice Keene writing those letters. And if you believe a girl like Nora deserves to have the truth told about her, take a moment to subscribe before we reach the part where 52 years of silence finally cracked. Because the thing that finally reopened Nora Keene's case wasn't a letter, or a witness, or a confession. It was a young detective who read old accident rulings for a living, looking for the murders hidden inside them. By the early 2020s, cold case units across the country had started doing something new, going back through decades of deaths that had been quietly filed as accidents or misadventures, and asking whether the science of the time had simply missed a crime. In 2022, one of those detectives, a state investigator named Elena Marsh, pulled a thin, yellowed file after receiving yet another letter from a retired school teacher named Alice Keene. Marsh did the thing no one in 1971 had bothered to do. She sent Nora's original autopsy findings to a modern medical examiner. The answer came back clear. The injuries on Nora Keene were not consistent with a fall into a river. They were consistent with someone's hands. 52 years after it was closed, the case was reclassified from accident to homicide. Then Marsh went looking for evidence and found exactly where an old patrolman had promised it would be, a box holding Nora Keene's coat, and, sealed in it, a single hair from the collar that had never belonged to Nora. Here's what the science could now do that it couldn't in 1971. When investigators have DNA from a crime scene, but no name to match it to, they can compare it against the large public genealogy databases that ordinary people upload to when they research their family trees. The person who left the DNA doesn't need to have ever been tested. You only need a relative, a cousin, even a distant one who has. From there, genealogists build the family tree until the branches close on a single name. A profile was built from the hair and uploaded in the winter of 2022. And the match that came back was not distant at all. It was startlingly close. Because the man at the top of that tree had, some years earlier, mailed his own saliva to an ancestry company out of pure vanity, wanting documentation of a bloodline he had always been proud of. His pride had, in the end, handed investigators his name. The name at the end of the tree was Everett Nash. Detective Marsh sat with it a long time. The man in the portrait in the faculty club. The name above the library door. The family whose kindness had paid for Nora's funeral. The golden boy who, 52 years earlier, had kept finding reasons to pass a mill girl's book cart. A genealogy match is a lead, not a conviction. But this time, there was no need to lift a discarded cup or wait outside a diner. The reclassified homicide, the preserved hair, and the family tree were enough to take to a judge, who signed an order compelling Everett Nash to give a DNA sample directly. Investigators served that order at the Nash estate on the hill, a few hundred yards above the valley where Nora Keene grew up. The sample matched the hair in her collar. It matched beyond any argument. By then, Everett Nash was 79 years old, chairman emeritus, his name on the library, his portrait in the club, a dedication in his honor already on the university's calendar for that spring. When the investigators came up the long drive to arrest him, he was, witnesses said, entirely calm. A man who had spent 52 years being told by everyone around him that he was untouchable, and who perhaps had come to half believe that the story would protect him forever. It didn't. The news went through Corliss the way the mill whistle once had, reaching every house at once. Up on the hill, the reaction was disbelief, and then something worse, the slow, sick understanding of a whole institution that had carved a killer's name over its own front door and taught 2 generations of students to walk beneath it. There were arguments about the portrait. There were arguments about the endowment. There were alumni who defended him to the end, because to believe it was to admit that the hill had spent 50 years protecting one of its own from a girl in the valley. That was the whole architecture of how he'd gotten away with it. In 1971, a poor girl's death was an accident, and a rich man's name was above suspicion, and the town had been grateful enough to leave both alone. Everett Nash was indicted for murder. His lawyers argued his age and his standing. The hair and the collar argued back, and it did not care about either. A jury convicted him. He will end his life a prisoner, and the honorary degree, the portrait, and the name above the library were all, one by one, taken down. But I don't want to leave you with the man on the hill. I want to leave you with the girl in the valley. Because the last picture of this story shouldn't be an old man being led down a long drive. It should be a 19-year-old girl in her dead father's flannel shirt, humming to herself as she wheeled a cart through the stacks of a library on a hill, stopping now and then to pull the little card from her coat pocket and add one more title to the list of books she meant to read someday, when there was finally time. That's who Nora Keene was. That was the life that was taken, one she never got to spend. Alice Keene lived to see the verdict. She is a retired teacher now, in her 60s, still in the valley. When they took Everett Nash's name off the library, the town began to talk about what to put there instead, and there is a petition, growing every week, to carve above that door the name of the girl who once shelved its books. Alice has said that if it happens, the first thing she will do is walk inside, sit down in the reading room, and finally read her sister's list, one book at a time, out loud. There is a particular cruelty in being killed twice, once by a man's hands, and again by a town's decision that your life was not worth asking questions about. For 52 years, Nora Keene was a story about a careless girl and a high river. She was never that. She was a young woman who couldn't swim, walking home from an honest day's work, who trusted the wrong man on a dark path, because in Corliss you were taught to trust the people from the hill. She got her name back not because anyone powerful finally cared, but because a rookie cop saved a coat, a little sister never stopped writing letters, and a stranger's cheek swab in a database undid a bloodline a proud man couldn't stop bragging about. It leaves you with hard questions. How many deaths from that era, filed away as accidents and misadventures, were something else that no one with power wanted to look at? How much silence has been bought over the years by a well-timed act of generosity? And how many names are carved over doors right now that no one has thought to question, simply because the person gave enough that no one ever wanted to? If Nora's story stayed with you, leave her name in the comments, so that after 52 years it's said one more time by someone who knows the truth. Subscribe, so the next family still writing letters no one answers doesn't write them into the dark. And look a little closer, out there, at the stories your town has decided to stop questioning. Because sometimes the truth isn't hiding in the shadows. Sometimes it's carved in stone, right over the door, waiting 52 years for someone to finally read the name underneath.